park ranger in Monument Valley for almost a decade, long enough to know every shadow carved by those towering sandstone buttes, every trick the wind plays on an empty mind. The desert can get into your head if you let it, but over the years, I've gotten good at tuning it out. At least I thought I had. Lately, things had gotten weird. I started hearing more and more complaints from tourists about screams at night, unearthly howls that carried over the rocky expanse. At first, I wrote it off as typical desert strangeness, sound bouncing around the canyons, warping like some ghostly trick of the land. But the reports kept coming, piling up in my incident log like a bad omen. One couple swore they heard a woman crying for help, trapped somewhere deep in the ravines. The husband said he could still hear it in his sleep, like the sound had clung to him. That was all unsettling enough, but the night it happened to me, it's something I'll never forget. It was a Wednesday, the kind of frigid desert night where the cold wraps around you like a vice, the sky blacker than tar except for a sliver of pale moon. I was alone at the ranger station, nursing a cup of cold coffee, when the call came through. "Ranger Wallace," a man's voice stammered over the radio, raw and frightened. "We're camped out by Sentinel Butte. There's something out there. We heard someone screaming. My wife is terrified." My gut clenched. I let out a sigh and rubbed my eyes, feeling the kind of fatigue that settled deep in the bones. "All right," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "Stay where you are. I'll check it out." I grabbed my flashlight and gear, then headed out to the Jeep. The drive was slow, the trail to Sentinel Butte a mess of rough terrain that kept me gripping the wheel with white knuckles. The headlights barely made a dent in the darkness, shadows flickering over the rocks as if they had a mind of their own. Eventually, the trail got too treacherous for the Jeep, so I parked and went on foot. The night air sliced through my coat, and every step I took seemed too loud, like the earth itself was warning me to tread carefully. I listened as I walked, hoping to hear nothing but the rustle of desert life. But there it was, a voice, faint and twisted, floating on the wind. It sounded like a woman's scream, but wrong, echoing in a way that made my chest tighten. The voice wove through the sandstone walls, twisting around me, never coming from one place long enough for me to pin it down. I swallowed, feeling that familiar prickle of unease. "Hello?" I called out, and the sound of my own voice felt absurd against the vastness of the canyon. The echoes bounced back to me, but no one answered. I climbed farther up the rocks, following the sound as it seemed to shift and slide away, always just out of reach. The desert was alive, and I was its plaything. Just as I was starting to wonder if I was losing it, I saw something on a ledge across the canyon. At first, I thought it was an animal. A wolf, maybe, hunched low on its haunches. But as I focused my flashlight, my hand trembling slightly, the thing moved in a way that defied nature. It unfolded, limbs twisting and snapping into grotesque shapes, something half human, half beast, as if its very form was rebelling against itself. Its eyes. God, its eyes. They glowed an unnatural yellow, locking onto mine with a predatory awareness. It was almost like it was smiling, mocking me for thinking I was the one in control out here. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then, it opened its mouth, if that gaping maw could even be called that, and out came a voice. My voice. "Ranger Wallace," it echoed, pitch perfect, the sound wrapped in that same eerie distortion. Hearing my own words coming out of that twisted thing felt like a violation, like something had crawled inside me and learned how to speak from the inside out. I staggered back, adrenaline flooding me, my hand fumbling for the pistol on my hip. But before I could even draw, The creature's head snapped to the side and it laughed, a sound that started like a human chuckle and ended in a bone-chilling animal cry. I turned and ran, half tripping over the loose stones as I stumbled down the canyon. Every step felt like it took an eternity, the darkness pressing around me, my ears straining for any sign that the creature was following. When I finally made it to the bottom and dared to look back, the ledge was empty, shadows crawling back into place as if nothing had happened. The Jeep was a beacon of salvation in that abyss. I threw myself into the driver's seat, heart hammering as I locked the doors and sped away, headlights piercing through the blackness. I didn't let myself breathe until I saw the distant glow of the ranger station. Once I was back inside, I slammed the door and locked it, hands still shaking. I sat at my desk, replaying the encounter over and over, the thing's imitation of my voice reverberating in my skull. The desert wasn't just haunted by echoes. It was something else entirely, something ancient and aware, and it had finally turned its attention to me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the creature's twisted shape, hear it mimicking my voice, feel its gaze following me into the corners of my mind. I kept the lights on in the ranger station, huddled at my desk with a useless cup of cold coffee and my service pistol laid out in front of me like a talisman. Every creak and rustle outside sent a jolt of electricity up my spine. The desert didn't feel like a vast, empty expanse anymore. It felt alive, and I was trapped in its grip. When dawn finally bled across the horizon, turning the sky into a watercolor of orange and pink, I tried to shake off the night's terror. But even the light felt weak, like it wasn't enough to drive away whatever lurked out there. Still, duty called, and routine was the only thing holding me together. I grabbed my logbook and forced myself to write it all down. The call from the campers, the screams, the creature on the ledge. I left out the part about how my knees had nearly given out, or how I'd barely kept from pissing myself when it spoke. Just as I finished, the radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Wallace, you there?" It was Steve Mallory, one of the other rangers, his voice too cheerful for the hour. I swallowed the lingering anxiety and grabbed the receiver. "Yeah, I'm here," I managed, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "Good," Steve said. "We've got a situation out near the North Rim campsites. A couple of hikers found something odd. You mind checking it out?" I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to stay locked in the safety of the station. But I was a ranger, and fear wasn't supposed to be an excuse. "On my way," I said, packing my gear and trying not to dwell on the dread pooling in my gut. The North Rim campsites were a good 20-minute drive, the terrain rough and unpredictable. I took the Jeep along narrow dirt trails, the morning sun doing little to warm the cold that had settled in my bones. The hikers were waiting for me at the trailhead, a young couple looking pale and shaken. They hovered close together, and the man, probably no older than 25, looked like he'd seen a ghost. I stepped out of the Jeep, trying to exude some kind of calm authority. "Morning," I greeted, hoping the smile I forced wasn't as fragile as it felt. "You reported something unusual?" The woman nodded, her eyes wide. "We were walking the rim trail at sunrise," she said, her voice shaky. "We found... well, you should see it for yourself." They led me up a short incline to the edge of the canyon. My boots crunched over gravel as we stopped in front of a small clearing. At first, I couldn't quite process what I was seeing. Then the details started to sink in, each one making my heart pound harder. In the dirt was a ring of stones, carefully arranged around what looked like the remains of a ritual fire. Animal bones were scattered around the circle, picked clean and placed in strange patterns that made no sense to me. But the worst part was what had been smeared across the stones in the ground. Symbols drawn in some dark, dried substance. Blood, I realized. It had to be. I crouched down, careful not to touch anything, The symbols were crude, almost childlike, but they held a sinister intent, as if someone had scribbled madness into the earth. I had heard stories about ceremonies out here, rituals tied to the Navajo skinwalker legends. This felt like a desecration, something darker. "This wasn't here yesterday," the man said, breaking the silence. His face was pale, his mouth pulled tight. "We hike this trail every morning." I stood up, forcing myself to sound confident. "Did you see anyone out here?" The couple exchanged a nervous glance. "No," the woman said. "But we heard something. It sounded like an animal, but different. Like it was struggling to make the right noises." My hand tightened around the grip of my flashlight. I nodded, taking a moment to breathe and think. "Thank you for reporting this," I told them. "You two should head back. I'll take it from here." They didn't argue. They seemed more than happy to leave, and I didn't blame them. As I watched them go, my thoughts spiraled. Rituals? Blood? What the hell was happening out here? Once they were gone, I circled the site, trying to find anything that made sense. The wind picked up, carrying with it the dry, metallic scent of blood mixed with the familiar desert dust. The echo of last night's encounter still haunted me, and standing there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the land was watching me. Then, just as I was about to head back to the Jeep, I heard it again. A voice. My voice, echoing up from the canyon clear as day.
"Wallace!"
It called, drawing out the syllables like a twisted song.
"Wallace! Here!"
My blood turned to ice. I stepped back, almost stumbling, my flashlight slicing through the daylight in a useless attempt to ward off whatever was out there. The voice echoed again, and this time I could hear the mockery in it, the way it mimicked my tone so perfectly that it made my skin crawl. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I bolted back to the Jeep, jumping inside and slamming the door shut. I forced myself to breathe, to stop my hands from shaking as I started the engine and sped away from that cursed clearing. The desert around me seemed to pulse with something ancient and cruel, and I could feel it pressing in on me, as if the canyons and rocks were closing ranks. I didn't just feel fear. I felt hunted. And whatever was out there, it had made sure I knew it. Back at the ranger station, I collapsed into the old, creaking office chair and tried to process what the hell I'd just experienced. I could still hear that voice, my own voice, calling me out of the canyon, mocking me. The memory clung to me, chilling even in the warm desert daylight. I had never been one to scare easily. The desert could be eerie, but I trusted my knowledge of the land, its patterns, and its creatures. But this was something else entirely, something beyond nature. I rubbed a hand over my face, feeling the scratch of stubble, and wondered who the hell I could talk to about this without sounding completely insane. The radio crackled to life, making me flinch. "Wallace, you copy?" It was Steve again, his voice cutting through the static. I grabbed the receiver, trying to mask the tension in my voice. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up?" "Just got a call from the visitor center," he said. "One of the guides mentioned you might want to speak to an old local named Joseph Yazzie. He came in today and asked if any rangers had been seeing strange things out near the buttes. I think he's worried about something." "Joseph Yazzie?" I repeated. The name was familiar. He was a respected elder in the Navajo community, someone whose stories about the land and its spirits held weight. If anyone knew what was happening out there, it might be him. "Thanks, Steve. I'll head over there." My grip on the receiver tightened. The idea of talking to Joseph both comforted and unsettled me. The elders knew more about the desert than anyone else, but their knowledge came with a price. You had to be prepared to hear things that didn't fit neatly into the rational world. I grabbed my keys and headed out. The visitor center sat on a windswept stretch of red sand and low brush, the parking lot empty except for a handful of dusty cars. I spotted Joseph Yazzie sitting on one of the benches outside, his silhouette hunched but steady, like an ancient piece of the landscape. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, and his weathered face was set in deep lines that spoke of both wisdom and worry. "Joseph," I greeted as I approached, my voice coming out more timid than I'd intended. He looked up, dark eyes assessing me with a careful, knowing gaze. "Ranger Wallace," he said, nodding. "I hear the desert has been restless." His voice was rough, like gravel underfoot, but steady in a way that made me feel young and unsteady. I sat beside him, the bench creaking under my weight. People have been hearing things, seeing things too. I hesitated, then pushed on. Last night, I heard something, and this morning, I found a ritual site out by the North Rim. Blood, bones, symbols. And then, I paused, the memory still too raw. Then I heard a voice, my voice, coming from the canyon. Joseph's expression darkened, and he nodded slowly, like he'd already expected this. "The skinwalker," he said, and the words felt like a stone dropping into a deep well, sending ripples of dread through me. "Do you know the stories?" "I've heard some," I admitted, though never in the way that mattered. Not like this. He looked out at the desert, the wind tugging at his hat. "The skinwalker is a witch," he began, his voice low. "Someone who has turned away from the path of healing to embrace dark power. They wear the skins of animals, stealing voices, twisting into shapes that don't belong to them. But it's more than just a curse. It's a hunger, a desire to destroy and corrupt." I thought back to the creature I had seen, the way it had shifted between animal and human, as if wearing a body that didn't fit. "Why now?" I asked, frustration bleeding into my fear. "Why is it making itself known?" Joseph's eyes met mine, and there was sorrow in them. Something must have disturbed it. An old wound in the land, or someone's trespass that broke a balance. He turned his gaze back to the horizon. Or perhaps it has simply chosen you. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Chosen me. I remembered the ritual site, the blood and bones arranged in strange patterns. It felt like a message, like something had been summoned and sent after me. "What can I do?" I asked, the desperation clear in my voice. Joseph's mouth set in a grim line. "There is little you can do alone," he said. "This is not a fight for a single man, but there are protections." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch, handing it to me. It felt heavy for its size, and when I opened it, I saw the mixture of herbs and crushed stones, the faint scent of sage and cedar rising from within. "This will not save you, but it may buy you time," he explained. "Keep it close, and do not let your mind slip into fear. The skinwalker feeds on that." I clutched the pouch like a lifeline. "Thank you," I murmured, though it felt woefully inadequate. Joseph studied me a moment longer, then rose to his feet, his movement slow but deliberate. "Listen to the land," he said, "and be careful where you tread." I left the visitor center with Joseph's warning echoing in my ears. The desert had never felt more hostile, every rustle and shift of the wind like a whisper, a watchful presence. I didn't go back to the station right away. Instead, I drove to a high overlook where the view stretched for miles, hoping to clear my head. I stood there for a long time, the protective pouch pressed tight in my hand. The canyon sprawled out below, a vast, jagged labyrinth of rock and shadow. As I stared into the emptiness, I tried to imagine the ancient forces that had shaped this land, forces that had been here long before people, before names, before anything that made sense. A chill rolled over me, and then I heard it again. A whisper, drifting up from the canyon floor. Not my voice this time, but something softer, more insidious. It almost sounded like crying. I backed away from the edge, heart thudding, my pulse a frantic drumbeat. I didn't want to hear more, didn't want to know what might be down there, waiting. But the desert didn't care what I wanted. It had already chosen me, and there was no easy way out. The desert night returned with a weight heavier than before, its shadows closing in around me as if the land itself had secrets it was desperate to keep. Back at the ranger station, I paced the floor, clutching the pouch Joseph had given me. The scent of sage mixed with the stale air inside the small building, but it was a thin shield against the encroaching terror that gripped me. The radio had been quiet for hours. No new calls, no signs of life beyond these walls. I considered calling Steve, but what could I say? That I was terrified of the land I'd worked for 10 years, of the night that now felt like a living, breathing thing. My hands were trembling, and I knew I couldn't stay cooped up inside forever. Maybe I was losing it, or maybe I needed to confront this, face whatever was hunting me, if only to prove that I still had some control. I stepped outside into the cold, bitter air. The darkness was thick, the moon a sliver buried behind clouds. The wind carried a low, mournful whisper, one that twisted around my ears and sounded disturbingly human. I tightened my grip on the pouch, shoving it deep into my jacket pocket, and walked toward the path that led up to Sentinel Butte. My flashlight cut a weak beam through the gloom, illuminating bits of scrub brush and the loose stones that scattered the trail. I told myself it was stupid, reckless, but something had to give, and waiting to be hunted was a hell of a lot worse than trying to take control, even if it was a fool's errand. About half a mile from the station, I stopped. The whispering was louder here, no longer a trickle of sound but a chorus, like a crowd of mourners gathered in the darkness. I swept my flashlight around, and the beam caught a flicker of movement. My pulse jumped. Something had been there, something big, and it had slipped behind a boulder just before I could catch a proper look. "Who's there?" I called, though I knew the answer wouldn't come in any way I wanted to hear. The whispering stopped abruptly, cut off like a severed thread. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was my own breathing, shallow and ragged. Then, a scraping noise came from behind me, the unmistakable sound of something dragging itself over the dirt and stone. I whipped around, my flashlight catching something that shouldn't exist. It was hunched low to the ground, caught in that inhuman stance I had seen before. Limbs contorted, a grotesque mixture of animal and man, with skin that shifted and twisted like something trying to crawl out of itself. The head was that of a coyote, but the eyes, they were human, yellow, hungry, and locked onto me. "Ranger Wallace," it whispered, my name coming out of its mouth like a caress, as if it were savoring the taste. This time, the voice wasn't just mine. It shifted, morphing into my mother's voice, then Steve's, then Joseph's. Each imitation was perfect, but twisted, laced with a mocking familiarity that sent ice through my veins. I stumbled back, hand going for my gun. The creature tilted its head, watching me with that sick, patient amusement. "You're afraid," it said, and I could swear it smiled, the coyote muzzle stretching in a way that made bile rise in my throat. The desert knows. It feeds. "Stay back," I warned, though my voice cracked, giving me away. I pulled my pistol from its holster, my fingers shaking. The thing took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I could hear the crunch of bones twisting beneath its skin. "Fear makes you weak," it said, now in Joseph's voice, thick with the elder's accent. "That's why it chose you. All your cracks, your doubts. Easy prey." I tried to steady my aim, but the truth was, it had me. I was terrified. The land I had thought I understood, the life I had carved out for myself here, all of it felt fragile and meaningless. The creature could see that, and it reveled in my helplessness. But then I remembered the pouch. Joseph's words echoed in my head. "Keep it close, and do not let your mind slip into fear." I had nothing left but that fragile protection. Desperate, I pulled it out, clutching it so tightly that the herbs and crushed stones pressed painfully into my palm. The creature's gaze shifted, narrowing. The amusement flickered, replaced with something darker, something angry. It recoiled slightly, a low growl rumbling up from its chest. I felt the shift, the way the air seemed to bend around us, and I realized Joseph's charm was doing something, however small. I seized that sliver of hope. "Get the hell away from me," I said, my voice growing stronger as I forced the fear back, one breath at a time. The creature hissed, and its body shuddered violently, the animal form rippling, the human features distorting into a mask of rage. For a heartbeat, it looked like it might lunge, but then it began to back away, melting into the shadows. "This isn't over," it whispered, the voice splitting, fracturing into 100 echoes that rippled through the night. "The desert has marked you, Wallace. You'll never be free." And then it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. The whispering wind returned, but the threat was fading, leaving only the cold and the desert's empty watch. I stood there, gun still drawn, hands still trembling, the pouch pressed to my chest. For a long time, I couldn't move. The terror had left me hollow, and I wondered if it would ever truly let me go. The creature was right. The desert had changed, had marked me somehow. This land was more than rocks and shadows now. It was a predator, patient and hungry, and I was caught in its sight. I made my way back to the ranger station, the dawn's first light barely beginning to break over the horizon. As the day returned, washing away the night's horrors, I knew that what had begun wasn't over. The desert would wait. It had all the time in the world. But so did I. And that had to be enough.